The following recording is a program of the World War I Historical Association. This special ongoing series commemorates the centennial of the First World War.
This is Dana Lombardi for the World War I Historical Association. On October 2nd and 3rd of 2015, a Collaboration Symposium was held between the WW1HA and the League of World War I Aviation Historians. This series presents the seminars offered at that symposium.
We're going to talk about aerial bombing in the first year and a half of the war. The subtitle for this talk is Crossing the Rubicon with Baby Steps, and the reason for the subtitle will become clear very shortly. Okay, prior to World War I, there were several Hague conventions at The Hague that were designed to set up rules for warfare, particularly rules that would protect civilians. Most of the work that they did was related to ground armies and naval operations. But they also put into the convention a stipulation that prohibited for 5 years the dropping of projectiles or explosives from balloons or other airships. This was ratified in 1899, although the convention was not ratified by either the United Kingdom or the US. I don't know whether it was because of the aerial part of it or not. Probably not, because that was really only a minor part of the convention. So after 5 years, they worked on renewing this. By 1907, they had come up with an agreement in which they extended that prohibition of dropping explosives from aircraft. But this time, it was only ratified by China, the United Kingdom, and the US. All of the other major powers did not ratify the convention in 1907. Nevertheless, when there was aerial bombing of cities starting in 1914, the country that was bombed invariably, whether they had signed the convention or not, complained that the convention was being violated. But this shows us the pre-war attitudes towards the bombing of cities and civilians. We move forward to the Mexican Revolution, just a few months before World War I began. In the port city of Mazatlan, a constitutionalist airplane accidentally bombed civilians while it was attacking a Federalist fort. There were 5 civilians killed and 16 wounded. Mexico, being a small power, had naval vessels from larger powers in their port, including U.S. and German vessels. The commanders of the German and U.S. ships in the port protested at this killing of civilians from the air. And so the Constitutionalist general apologized, and they set up protocols for being able to protect civilians from even accidental aerial attack. So these are the attitudes that existed prior to World War I, even up to just a few months before. We move now almost 30 years to the firebombing of Hamburg in 1943. The British Bomber Command and the U.S. Army Air Force conducted a number of raids over a period of a little over a week, firebombing raids on Hamburg. They absolutely leveled the city. created a firestorm, a tornado of flame, and this resulted in 45,000 deaths and 37,000 people wounded. So given the change in attitudes regarding aerial bombing, how did we get from one point to the other? That's actually one of the first themes that I want to cover in this talk. So we have various questions and themes that I want you to keep in mind as we go through the history of what happened in the first year and a half of the war. How did we cross the Rubicon, make the irreversible step of going from our pre-war attitudes towards the bombing of civilians to the horrors of World War II? How did the events of 1914, 1915 fit into that? One of our other themes, excuse me, is the immaturity of technology that was used during 1914, 1915. These are the baby steps that I refer to in the title. And actually, I think you will be amazed at the things that aviators accomplished in the first year and a half of the war, particularly given the immaturity of the technology they had to work with. Going along with the immaturity of this technology, I want you to pay attention to the experimental nature of bombing aviation in World War I, that they had to make everything up from scratch. This was a theme that I touched on yesterday. Another theme I want you to pay attention to is the evolution from general purpose aviation, general purpose squadrons that might do a variety of tasks with a variety of aircraft, to more specialized units where they'd all have the same type of aircraft and they're all doing the same thing. They're all doing bombing, or they're all doing artillery adjustment observation, things like that. Finally, I want you to pay attention to the role of naval aviation in the early development of bombing. If this were a college drinking game, you'd take a drink every time I say the word naval. All right, so pay attention for that. So those are the themes I want you to be thinking about. The events that we're going to be talking about is we're going to look at German bombing by both the Zeppelins and airplanes. We're going to look at, in succession, French bombing, British bombing, Russian and Italian bombing. Finally, we're going to finish up with a few slides on Gallipoli and talk about bombing done by both sides in the Gallipoli campaign. So starting with Zeppelin bombing. There was an attack by the German Army Zeppelin Z9 on the night of the 24th of August, 1914, very early in the war. It attacked the city of Antwerp, carrying 10 bombs. It dropped those bombs on the city. The city at the time was being besieged by the German army. There's an example of a photograph of the damage, and I put an arrow in to make it easier for you to see because it's really restricted to the second floor of this house where 2 women were wounded. There were 10 people killed, and the world was absolutely horrified at this breach of the Hague Convention, of this breach of propriety, morality. This was in the newspapers as far away as the United States. It was big news everywhere, Europe, the US, and so on. Dick Church talked last night about how the Germans were tone deaf to propaganda. They have actually, they created postcards, or German companies did, commemorating this event that horrified the rest of the world. In fact, I can't remember, one of the postcard vendors downstairs has either this postcard or the postcard that shows the bombing of Warsaw, which I'll show you shortly. Anyway, they're down there, they're available for sale. Even though only 10 people were killed, in what we would now call a minor air raid. The details were very shocking to the newspaper reading public on both sides of the Atlantic. One married couple was killed among those 10, and one of the other victims was actually decapitated by a bomb. So this was pretty gruesome stuff. Again, we're talking just a few months after the incidents in Mexico in May 1914. I showed you the postcards, which are sort of fanciful images. I thought I'd throw in a photograph of the actual Zeppelin Z9. And we will visit that Zeppelin again a little later in the talk. Pardon me. The Zeppelin started bombing England in 1915. Their first raid was only 19 days into the new year, in which two naval Zeppelins, take a drink, two naval Zeppelins raided England, and it resulted in 4 people being killed and 16 being wounded. Over the course of 1915, they made 20 Zeppelin raids on England, 39 sorties, and this resulted in 208 people killed, 522 wounded, virtually all of whom were civilians. Germany has clearly crossed the Rubicon by this point. The very first raid on London was on the night of the 31st of May. I've actually walked the route of that Zeppelin raid in the Stoke Newington neighborhood in North London. The house that I took the picture of is the first building that was bombed in London, and the bomb in the insert, the photo of the bomb in the insert is the actual one that was dropped on the house. What happened there was this incendiary bomb in the picture lodged in the rafters of the house. The family was able to get out, and the husband bicycled to the local fire brigade. They came and put the fire out, and so the house still stands. When I visited it, there was no historical marker on it, but my understanding is that with the centennial of the First World War, that there is now a historical marker on that building. The Germans also conducted airship raids on the Eastern Front. And I have to tell you, there's not a lot written in English on this. Really, the best source is by the late Augie Bloom, who was a member of the League for a long time. And he published an article in Over the Front in September 1998. And most of what we really know is about these Zeppelin bombings on the Eastern Front was written by Augie Bloom. The German Army and Navy rotated in and out airships in and out of the Eastern Front for short periods where they were used for reconnaissance as well as for bombing. In any one month there might be a couple of airships or up to 8 airships in use. Their most common targets for their bombing raids were the rail network, and you'll find this as a very common theme in World War I bombing. They also attacked troop concentrations and things like munitions depots and so on. The weather and other circumstances were not very good to these airships. At least 12 of them were lost to weather and ground fire and accidents. So this postcard of the bombing of Warsaw, color postcard, either that one or one of the bombing of Antwerp, I don't remember which one, is available or was available yesterday afternoon from the postcard vendors. If you want a copy of your very own. I mapped out where the airship raids took place to sort of get a picture of it. And so I've marked on this map, which I took from the Over the Front issue, in yellow boxes, the the airship bases. And then to the right, in blue highlighter, I marked the places that were bombed. And so these are fairly substantial raids. It's probably up to a couple hundred miles. And Warsaw had the distinction of being first a target of the airships, and then after the German army took over Warsaw on the 5th of August 1915, then they started using Warsaw as a Zeppelin base. So they hit places like Vilnius, Brest-Litovsk, Warsaw, and then a lot of other places that are not as well known. German airplane bombing. Once the battle line stabilized on the Western Front, and you no longer had a war of movement, it really created an opportunity for bombing. The fact that you didn't have to worry about who was below you and not having any idea, with clearly marked trench lines, you now knew pretty much that you were bombing the enemy and not your own troops. So it really made a lot of opportunities for dropping bombs from aircraft. The Army High Command created a dedicated bombing group very early on, and that was solely under their command. It was not under the command of lower level Army commanders. And this was in December 1914. This is part of our theme of moving from generalized units to specialized units. This is a very advanced thing that the German Army was doing, was creating a specialized bombing unit as early as December 1914. They gave it the cover name of the Ostend Carrier Pigeon Section, BAO in the German initials. And their hope was that once the Germans occupied Calais, that they would be able to bomb England from Calais with their aircraft. The Germans never did occupy Calais in World War I, and so ultimately they used the BAO for other bombing missions on both fronts. They flew from Ostend in occupied Belgium. They flew from Metz, and they flew on the Russian and Galician fronts. It's interesting because they actually had this based on a train. They had all of their personnel, or at least all of the officers, living on a train, and so it was fairly easy to move from one front to another. Or even during the times when they were in occupied Belgium, they were susceptible to Allied bombing raids. And so they could take all of the air crews, and they could take them at night at dusk to another location, and that way they would be safe from being found by Allied bombers overnight. And then they'd move the whole train back, and they'd resume operations in the morning. The best source for this is a book by Peter Kilduff. Best and about the only source on this very early bombing is a book by Peter Kilduff, Germany's First Air Force. The Ostend Carrier Pigeon Section was using, of course, at that time, very primitive aircraft. They were using B-type aircraft by the Albatros, Aviatique, LVG, and Otto companies. There's a picture of an LVG B-1 when it was on the Eastern Front in the photo. They could carry 8 small bombs each. And generally the types of targets they were after, and they were doing Army support, were troops, convoys, rail stations, ports, depots, things like that. They also flew Sperrflüge, which are barrage flights. Back before they really had fighter aircraft, they were struggling with the concept of how to keep the enemy airplanes from being on their own side of the lines. And so the And so the Germans, and also the French, came up with the idea of using bomber aircraft, which had machine guns, to have kind of barrage flights up and down the lines to keep the enemy on their side of the line or shoot them down. It's actually, in hindsight, it's a very strange concept because the bombers are big, slow things by definition. And it didn't really work very well, for either the French or the Germans, but they both tried it. In the photograph of the LDG B-1, I want you to keep that in mind because in 2 more slides it's going to play a part in the bombing of Paris. So that's what the plane looks like, because I don't show the same picture again in 2 slides. Oh, this Ostend carrier pigeon section started with 31 pilots and 13 observers. So for 1914 and early 1915, it was actually a rather large unit by those standards. Later developments, later in 1915, they ended up getting better planes, the C-type airplanes like the Albatross C-1. They also had, they were also flying the AEG G-2s, which were twin-engine bombers, the picture of which is in there, and I think John mentioned those yesterday in his talk.
Yeah, they were originally conceived as one of these Sparrow bombers, well, not as a bomber, but as a flying fortress to put up this line across the lines. And when they found out that this was not efficient, they started thinking, what else can we do with them? And the most logical thing, and evolutionally speaking, the most productive thing was turn them into bombers.
Yep. So by December 1915, we have the next organizational development in German bombing. They had created this Ostend carrier pigeon section, an all-bombing unit. They created a second one that was based in Metz, BAM. And then in December 1915, they created a number of bombing groups, and they made, called Kagels, and they made those the Kagel 1 and 2, and then added on additional ones. Famously, the Germans did attack Paris with airplanes as early as the 30th of August, 1914. The first raid was near the Gare de l'Est in eastern Paris. It was actually one of the most important rail stations for moving troops to the front, just because of its position. Lieutenant von Hiddesen dropped 3 tiny bombs, which were actually a little larger than hand grenades, from an LVG B-1, like we saw 2 slides ago. 1 person was killed and 4 were wounded. A couple of years ago, when I was in Paris, I visited this site. The street is little more than an alley now, and my understanding is that there used to be a plaque up that commemorated this first place in Paris that was ever hit by an aerial bomb. But they widened one of the cross streets, and in all the construction, the plaque got moved or lost or something. French bombing. What we're looking at here is we are looking at a painting by Henri Faré, a French impressionist painter who was actually assigned to the first French bombardment group. And he actually flew with them and was working as a war artist with bombing aircraft, and then later with naval aircraft and other stuff, fighters and so on. There's going to be an article about him in World War I Illustrated, put out by the World War I Historical Association. That's coming up later this year. But this shows a Voisin bomber, one of the types that was used by the French. The other one was the one that I talked about yesterday, the Maurice Farman MF-11. At the very beginning, French bombing generally consisted of reconnaissance planes flying over the lines. They'd carry a few small bombs and flechettes, steel darts. You can see one in the lower left there. And they would kind of drop them on targets of convenience. That was, pardon me, that was bombing at the very beginning. But very early on, the end of September, they designated 2 of the Voisin squadrons to become bombing units. And then shortly after that, 23rd of November, they created a bombardment group with 3 Voisin squadrons with 4 planes each, under the command of Commandant Degois. On the 4th of December, the French bombed the city of Freiburg, just across the Rhine. They dropped 6 bombs on that city. The Germans pissed and moaned about this for years. You can find accounts in the early 1920s in which they complain about the horrible bombing of Freiburg. The Germans certainly would have said that the French crossed the Rubicon on the 4th of December. 1915 is characterized in my book as the brilliant but fleeting rise of daylight bombing. It was kind of a golden age. They were doing a lot of experimentation. They were making some very long-distance raids. They started what now would be called strategic bombing, and they had very little opposition. However, they were flying pusher planes, and they were very susceptible to being shot down from behind. And so by the end of the year 1915, it was pretty clear that the party was going to be over soon, and that they wouldn't be able to conduct these same daylight raids with impunity. Speaking on the theme of innovation, I want to give you an idea of what they had to do to create a bomber force. Because they started out with no bomb racks, no bomb sights, no machine guns, no methods for aiming, dropping bombs, navigating, or flying in formation. All of this stuff had to be created from scratch. The first bombardment group, GB1, was actually the incubator for all these new ideas. They were the innovators that really tried new equipment. They tried new tactics, and they were really kind of a laboratory for this stuff. They did get bomb racks in early March, and by the end of March, the French Air Force created 3 more bombing groups. They also came up with the innovative idea of creating target dossiers, in which they put together all of the intelligence they had on the target itself, including aerial photographs if they had them, because they wanted to be bombing precisely. You know, if you're trying to hit a particular munitions factory and on the outskirts of the city, you want to know where it is in relation to the city. They also wanted to be able to fly in such a way as to avoid the most accurate of the German anti-aircraft guns and to avoid the German airfield. So they put together these target dossiers, which was a very advanced idea for 1915. To give you an idea of some of these large raids, I've mapped them out. The red arrow is the attack on Ludwig, Shoppin, and Mannheim. They were attacking the BASF, company still exists, the BASF, poison gas plants, and actually was quite successful. They even caused a release of poison gas in the city of Mannheim from the factory. They conducted a reprisal raid on Karlsruhe. The raid was in reprisal for the shelling of the city of Verdun for bombing, German aerial bombing of the city of Nancy and the Zeppelin raids against London. So they conducted an attack on Karlsruhe and dropped leaflets to tell the Germans this is what we're doing and why we're doing it. That was the blue arrow. The green arrow is the oil refineries at Petrobran. The two black arrows are attacks on Dillingen and Saarbrücken, going after the German iron and steel industry. This is truly strategic bombing. They are not attacking battlefield targets. They're not attacking the army. They're attacking the enemy's industry. As I said, because they were flying pusher planes and they were eventually coming up against the Fokker Rheindecker, one of the first fighter planes, these great successes did not last. And so they had to scale back what they did and make changes, flying at night, things like that, after 1915. We're going to move now to British bombing. There were a series of very interesting Royal Naval Air Service attacks on Zeppelin sheds in Germany in 1914. Just amazing, daring long-distance raids. They attacked Zeppelin sheds in Dusseldorf, Cologne, Friedrichshafen, and Cox Haven. I'll show you a map in a minute so you can get an idea of the scale of this. The Cox Haven Raid, which is on the North Sea, was a carrier-based airstrike, first in the world, on I think it was Christmas Eve, 1914. In the course of these attacks, they did succeed in destroying one Zeppelin, our old friend, the Army Zeppelin Z9. And the picture is one that I took from the Royal Air Force Museum. I mean, I photographed it, I didn't steal it.
Could you clarify that?
Yeah.
Likely story.
Yeah, and I'm sticking to it too. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I mapped out for you these raids because they're absolutely phenomenal. I mean, you look at them, and they're up and down the entire Western Front. They're traveling at great distances. You can see what 100 miles is in the little box left to the left of the map. Up at the top, you've got the Cox Haven Raid, which was from the North Sea. You've got, before the fall of Antwerp in Belgium, you had Royal Naval Air Service planes flying out of there and hitting Dusseldorf and Cologne, and then way down at Belfort, which we remember from yesterday's talk, where MF-29 was based. They flew out of there and crossed a little section of Switzerland illegally, and hit the Zeppelin sheds at Friedrichshafen, which was where the Zeppelins were built. The picture, another Royal Air Force Museum painting, shows the Avro 504 bombers attacking Friedrichshafen. Although, as I said before, only one Zeppelin was destroyed in the course of all these raids. But still, they're a phenomenal achievement for 1914 with the planes that they were using. There's a couple of very good books on them they're published by Osprey. One is called the Zeppelin Base Raids, and the other is called the Flat Pack Bombers. And it's really very exciting stuff. It's very interesting to read. The Royal Flying Corps, which was attached to the British Army, the BEF, was also doing bombing. They were doing tactical bombing on the Western Front, and they were attacking rail stations and troop concentrations and depots and stuff like that. But one thing that was very interesting when I started researching this was that the Royal Flying Corps headquarters did a study where they looked at 141 attacks by both the French and the British, attacks on rail stations They determined that out of 141, only 3 of them had impeded the German army at all. So they came up with a different strategy. They decided instead of bombing rail stations, they would bomb trains. The idea was that if you bomb a rail station, and let's say you tear up the track, you put bomb craters in the track bed, things like that, it doesn't take that long to fix it. But if you can destroy a train, you've got a train sitting on the track someplace, burning, and so you've got to move the damn thing after it's all over to make the track usable. And if it actually burned, like from munitions or something, then a whole large section of the track is destroyed. So they decided to change their tactics. Instead of bombing rail stations, they would bomb trains wherever they found them. They also decided to work jointly with the French so that they could concentrate their small air forces on this target when they needed to. And they decided only to hit the rail network during major offensives, when it really would do some good. The Germans need to move troops and supplies in during a major offensive, and so that's when they're going to try and cut the rail network, and they'll leave it alone the rest of the time. These tactics were used for the first time in the Battle of Loos in September 1915. One very interesting footnote to this is that after World War I ended, the U.S. Army Air Service conducted a bombing survey in the occupied Rhineland. And they were looking at bombing that was done by the British and the French and a little bit by the Americans. And they concluded that it turns out there were a lot of attacks on rail stations by Britain's independent force in 1918. And they also had the same problem they discovered after the war of them not doing much damage that would interrupt the rail system very long. So what I'm wondering is, okay, if they figured all this out in mid-1915, why were they making the same mistake still in 1918? And I don't know the answer to that.
They never learned.
They never learned, yes. One other interesting development was the development by the British of the CFS, the Central Flying School bomb sight. This was used with a stopwatch and gave fairly good results as a bomb sight. I'm not listing this because they were the only ones to develop a bomb sight, because they certainly weren't, but it's an example of the type of innovation that was going on through 1915 with bomb sights, and I had a good picture of this one. Okay? So you've got these things being developed by essentially all the air forces. Okay, Russian bombing, the Ilya Muromets. Igor Sikorsky developed a huge 4-engine airplane called the Grand in 1913. At the time, it was the largest airplane in the world, and as the war started, he started manufacturing them for use in reconnaissance and bombing. They continued to be the largest aircraft in the world with 4 engines, certainly at least through 1915. I don't know how long they held the title, but it was pretty substantial for what's normally considered a backward country technologically. They were first used operationally in late February 1915. And because they were ramping up the production, and these are huge things to build, they had up to about 9 at any one time throughout 1915. They had more in 1916. Most of the missions, it was really not exactly a bomber. It was more like a reconnaissance plane that was really good at bombing. That was how they used it. Most of their missions were really reconnaissance missions. And if there was any bombing that would be done, they would carry the bombs along. Frequently, the targets would be decided by the commander, sometimes after they were up in the air. The Russians were using a very advanced technique. Because this was a photo reconnaissance plane, they used the technique of taking photographs of their bomb damage, sometimes on the bombing pass itself, sometimes they'd come around for another pass after they dropped their bombs and get the photographs then. So they were using this for bomb damage assessment in 1915. Very advanced technique. Finally, in reading the first-hand accounts of what they were doing, their bombing seems incredibly accurate. And I'm slightly dubious because, you know, fighter pilots always shoot down more planes than, always claim to shoot down more planes than they really do, and bombing pilots always claim to have hit much better than they really did when you go back and evaluate it. But it's very interesting. It seems like they're able to be incredibly accurate on their very first pass and then their second pass. And so it appears that perhaps they had extremely good bomb sights. Organizationally, the Ilya Muromets aircraft were organized in what was called the Squadron of Flying Ships, EVK. And again, this is 1915, and this is an advanced concept. They're almost up there with the French and the Germans. Their primary target, of course, was the rail network for their bombs. They also attacked airfields, artillery, especially anti-aircraft artillery. They hated anti-aircraft artillery, and since they had the option of dropping bombs on whatever they felt like, they did a lot of attacks on German anti-aircraft batteries. They attacked wagon trains and German mobile bakeries. The picture here is a colorized postcard from the time of a German mobile bakery. They like to attack those as well as troops. Their missions were often in excess of 4 hours, which by World War I standards is amazing. World War I standards and 1915 standards especially. Typically they would carry just over a quarter of a ton of bombs. The Ilya Muromets was one of the coolest planes produced produced in World War I. It's not as famous as the Fokker triplane, but another contender for a very cool airplane is the series of Italian Caproni bombers. These were 3-engine bombers, and they were the version that was used in 1915 had 3 100 horsepower Fiat engines. There were later versions that were produced, including the one that you can see in the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. That was a later version of the same plane. And so they continued developing them through the rest of the war. Their very first mission was on the 20th of August, 1915. 2 Capronis attacked an Austro-Hungarian airfield with 35 bombs. Now, because they weren't doing any bombing until the 20th of August, at least not with Capronis, there's not a lot that they did during 1915, which is within the scope of our course. But by the end of the year, they had 12 Capronis flying in 3 different squadrons out of Pordenone in northern Italy. They would fly up north over the Austro-Hungarian border. Once again, in terms of our theme of organizational development, they had all of their planes in. They had only one type of airplane per squadron, which was again a very advanced concept for this time. They attacked airfields, road and rail traffic, and rail stations in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As I said before, there were more advanced versions of the Caproni bomber that were produced through 1918. Okay, I'm going to talk about Gallipoli. Don't worry, Paul, I'm not going to say too much. Paul's talking on the same subject. But first, I need to give you kind of a strategic snapshot of the Gallipoli campaign, because to know what's going on in the air, you really need to know what's going on the ground and on the water. And so I just want to introduce that. When Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, entered World War I in December 1914, I think, suddenly the route to Russia was blocked. 80% of Russia's trade went through the straits controlled by the Ottomans, the Bosporus Strait, which led into the Black Sea, and the Straits of the Dardanelles, which took you into the Mediterranean. Suddenly, 80% of Russia's trade was blocked by one of Germany's allies. To make Russia an effective partner in the war, the British and French decided that they couldn't let this situation stand, and so they came up with a plan to force the Dardanelles, in the phrase, that they would send warships up the Dardanelles Strait and past the forts that were guarding it, and they would go up and attack the capital city of Istanbul, which is just a little bit to the left of where the arrow is for the Bosporus Straits. They made this attempt on the 18th of March, 1915, and it was a disaster, as I'm sure you all know. A number of very large French and British warships were sunk. They could not get through because of the mines and the forts. So they decided instead that they would invade the Gallipoli Peninsula and either take the forts from behind or nullify them with artillery fire, and then they would be able to send their fleets up the Dardanelles to be able to shell Constantinople and take it out and take the Ottoman Empire out of the war. So they invaded, the French and the British invaded Gallipoli on the 25th of April, 1915. You probably all know that this was a disaster for them, and ultimately they had to leave the Dardanelles. I don't think I'm spoiling the story for anybody. But bombing was used here to interdict the Turkish resupply of troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula, or bombing was used by the Turks to try to nullify those efforts. So that's what we're going to talk about with Gallipoli. The bombing and the air fighting actually were less important aspects of aviation in the Gallipoli campaign than reconnaissance and naval gunfire adjustment. Those were really the important things in aviation in Gallipoli, but that's not what my topic is. Okay, so I want to talk about the order of battle. What kind of units were there? I'm going to start with the British. The British had two wings of the Royal Naval Air Service. First the 3rd Wing and 3 Wing, and then 2 Wing joined them later. They were based on the islands of Imbros and Tenedos. They had airfields there. And they were flying kind of a motley collection of primitive airplanes, BE-2s, Voisins, Newport 10s and 12s. There was also, among the British forces, there were 2 seaplane carriers, the Ark Royal and then the Ben My Chree. And so they carried seaplanes on them. They would use cranes to lift them off the ship and into the water, and they would take off and do something, and then come back, and they'd lift them back up and put them on the ship. The French had a squadron at Tenedos, Escadrille MF-98T, T for Tenedos, and they had first 6 and then later a total of 9 Maurice Farman MF-11s. And I told you yesterday about how primitive those were. The German unit there was called the Wasserfliegerabteilung, the water aircraft section, and they were flying float planes. Go to WD-1 and WD-2 float planes. They had about 10 to 15 at any one time. They were based initially at Çanakkale. In British, French, and American maps of this time period, it's always called Chanak, but the name is and was Çanakkale for that beautiful little town on the Dardanelles, and that's where the German flag and the Turkish flag are on in the center of the map. So they were based there at Çanakkale, and then a little later on, in mid-1915, they also created a unit up on the Sea of Marmara in the upper right at Rodasto. Now I've got the German unit there in the upper right, and then I've got Turkish Naval Aviation ? They were flying, there were certainly German commanded and German built planes flying against the Allies at Gallipoli in 1915. It is not clear to me if there were Turkish commanded planes, also German built. It's not clear to me if there were Turkish commanded planes that were also flying during 1915. There certainly were afterwards in 1916, but it's not clear to me from my readings as to whether the Turks also had some of the planes there. In the bases that they had, you'd have the German airplanes, but they would be Turkish naval bases. And so you'd have Turkish personnel running them. And so I'm not exactly sure, were there Turkish aircraft assets there or not? I just can't tell you. Okay, so that's our order of battle. The Allied bombing targets, I'm going to start on the left-hand side of the map. The Allied bombing targets for the French and British, both on the islands and out at sea, were Turkish bivouacs on the Gallipoli Peninsula itself. Then moving counterclockwise, they were attacking the port at Çanakkale and the seaplane base. They were also attacking the coal depot at Nogara, a little bit farther up the coast. They were attacking flour mills in Gallipoli town on the Gallipoli Peninsula. They were attacking Turkish ships in the Sea of Marmara that were trying to resupply the Turkish army on the Gallipoli Peninsula. And they were also attacking road and rail links that were on the peninsula itself and leading up to it to try to prevent resupply. Finally, in November and December 1915, by that time Bulgaria had entered the war, and suddenly Turkey had a rail link to Bulgaria, and therefore they had a rail link to Germany for resupply. And so the British and the French were attacking up at the town of Feridjik, something like that. They were attacking the rail line that went through there and the railroad bridge that went over the river to try to interdict supplies coming from the other Central Powers countries. The article in Over the Front that talks about a lot of this stuff was written by the late Dick Lehman, and he concluded in that article that theoretically bombing the Turkish supply lines could have made a real impact on the Battle of Gallipoli, but that essentially there were not enough airplanes and their performance was not good enough to be able to accomplish that. The number of Allied planes never exceeded 60 at any time during the Gallipoli campaign. Okay, so these are the targets that the Allies went after. The targets that the Germans and perhaps the Ottoman aircraft went after. First, they were going after the two Allied airfields on the islands of Imbros and Tenedos, and they were going after any Allied ships they could find in the Aegean Sea, just to the west of the Gallipoli Peninsula. They were doing this when they were based at Çanakkale. And then finally, you had British submarines also operating in the Sea of Marmara, trying to interdict Turkish shipping that was resupplying the Turks on the Gallipoli Peninsula. And so you have the German seaplanes going after the British submarines in that sea. The number of Central Powers aircraft never exceeded 20 at any one time. In one of the issues of Over the Front that I was using for doing this research, I found this marvelous picture of a group of Turkish soldiers after the Gallipoli campaign was over, and they're posing by a captured French artillery piece. Nice picture. The thing is, you can still find tourists posing in front of that artillery piece at Gallipoli. And I'll take your questions. Yes, Tom?
On the raid at Cox Haven rather, the first carrier raid, do you have any numbers on the types of airplanes and numbers that the Brits used?
Yes. The question was on the Cox Haven Raid, which was the first carrier-based airstrike, on the types of planes and the numbers. They were using, I think it was several different kinds of Short Brothers Company float planes. And the number of aircraft, I'm thinking maybe 12 to 15. There's actually a very good book on that called The Cox Haven Raid by Dick Layton. Dick Layman, pardon me. And it really covers that in great detail. But the numbers are known. I just can't pull them off the top of my head. Yeah, it's a very famous event.
Did the Allies have their own versions of the Zeppelin type raids early in the war?
Good.
The Allies had
Good question.
Aircraft?
Yes, it turns out, and I didn't mention this because I've got so much stuff to cover in a short amount of time, that the French and the Italians used blimps as bombers. In fact, one of the very first French air raids of World War I was conducted by a French blimp. You know, we're not talking the size of Zeppelins, we're talking about the size of the Goodyear blimp, that attacked the German rail station at Carthaus on the 9th of August, very early in the war. So they used them, and they weren't particularly effective, and they didn't have a lot of them, so I didn't even mention them. Although it's kind of a fun topic, because it's just such an oddball thing. They could carry more bombs than an airplane, but still it wasn't a lot. Yeah. Yes.
Steve, just quick observations. The U.S. Army Singapore, of course, had a big inception of some substance. And We all know that the search for the lost, so-called lost battalion in America involved some pigeon activity. But the thing I wanted to mention is that the 1st Division Museum has a small handful collection of Henri Fauré paintings. I think 8 of them. The largest collection, I think, still remains at the Air Force Academy. But for those of you that are doing research and would like some Henri Fauré kind of images, I'm sure the museum would be amenable to granting you some image permissions.
Okay, that's good to know. Actually, the largest Fauré collection is at the is owned by the Air Force Museum, and it's, at least at the moment, it's not at the Air Force Academy. But yeah, I wish I'd seen that, because it's a topic that interests me greatly.
Ron?
Besides serving as a laboratory for developing equipment and techniques and procedures and so forth, was bombing in 1915 worth the effort and the expense?
That's a good question. The question was, besides serving as the first bombardment group, serving as the incubator for bombing and experimentation among the French, was it worth the effort and the expense? They had, I think if you were to look at it from a research and development point of view, I think the answer would be yes. They did have a few very successful raids, like the Ludwig Mannheim raid, for example. But like I said yesterday in talking about Escadrille MF-29, there was, and this relates to pretty much all bombing in World War I, there was really never enough airplanes and bombs on target to really accomplish something. And so, it's a hard question to answer, but the answer isn't as to whether it was worth the expense. But the answer isn't necessarily yes, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Doctor, would you please stand, sir?
Okay, was there any torpedo bombing during the Gallipoli campaign, or attempting torpedoes?
I'll talk about that.
Oh, okay, good. I'm glad you're going to talk about it, because I didn't know the answer.
John, you have a question. John?
I was just going to respond to what Steve said. I think there's different ways of evaluating bombing, whether it's worth it or not. The direct damage was probably pretty minor, but the psychological effect on both sides, and then the expenditure of effort by both sides to protect population consumed an enormous amount of resources.
Yes.
You just have to look at Paris and how many sandbags they put around things, and the sheer effort to move dirt, sandbags, would just be one example. Develop an anti-aircraft gun, and the crews man them where another. The Royal Flying Corps had to defend London against the Zeppelin. There's a huge amount of effort went into that. So
yes.
The indirect effects are often much greater than the setting fire to a train station.
I think that's a good response. Okay, we can.
One more question, please.
As far as the rather modest Gallipoli air campaign is concerned, 2 other precedents that were spin-offs of it were the first rescue of a downed pilot from behind enemy lines by Richard Bell Davies, for which he got the Victoria Cross. And on the other side, I forget the name offhand, but the first black aviator saw action on the Turkish side, the son of a freed slave from North Africa who became a career officer in their navy and who became interested when they adopted aircraft, and he may have been flying with the Turkish naval squadron.
He was, but not until 1916. His name was Ali Ahmet. And actually, in constructing this talk, I had a picture with him in it, and then I had to cut it because it was not 1915, and the talk was getting too long anyway. So I'm glad you brought it up, because it's a very interesting sidelight. Yeah.
Thank you.